Welcome once again to the Upper Room. Great to be with you. Let's jump right into it. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a television show that was on that was hilarious. And if you're an old person like myself, you'll remember this show. It was called The Carol Burnett Show, and it had this cast of characters like Harvey Korman and Tim Conway, and one of the actors or actresses on that show was a gal by the name of Vicki Lawrence. Do you remember her? She played some great roles. They just did skits that were funny. Today they'd be politically incorrect. They probably couldn't be on TV today at all. But you can go back and watch reruns of it if you want. Vicki Lawrence, in one skit, played Mama. She was this, even though she's a young lady, she came through an appearance, and by her acting as this grandma-like character that was just brash and too honest, about everything. And so it was a lot of fun. I want to go back to Vicki Lawrence in one of those skits called Mama. And by the way, she was in all 11 seasons of The Carol Burnett Show. Only Carol Burnett herself was also in all 11 seasons. So you know that she was a remarkable talent. But in one scenario, and by the way, this skit of Mama, it actually spun off into a sitcom, I think by the same name, not sure. But in one of those skits, her daughter, who would be like an adult daughter, said to her, she said, "Mama, why do we have to go to church? I don't think you have to go to church to be saved." Mom then looks up at her over those granny glasses, and kind of gets that snarled look on her face, and she says, "No, you don't. But if you're going to jump out of a plane, it would sure be helpful to have a parachute, if you know what I mean." Great line. Not a great line because it's great theology, but a great line because she's challenging her daughter to think about it. Just think about it. And I believe that we struggle to do that these days. We struggle to actually think about why we believe what we do, why we do what we do, why we don't do what we don't do. Do you spend a lot of time thinking about it? In essence, that's what this new series we're into is all about. We're calling it Habits of the Heart. And as we said in the last lesson, the heart of every individual is the essence of every individual. It's where our thoughts, our mind, and our emotions and our will all come together. And so, as we read last week, Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, Solomon writes that we are to guard our hearts above all else, for it determines the course of our lives. Have you ever wondered what determines the course of my life? Is it just an accident? Is it just luck or bad luck? Solomon says, in all his wisdom, he says, no, the course of your life is such because of what goes on in your heart. And he gives us something to think about. And that's what we want to do in this series. I want to give you something to think about in terms of why are you where you are? Why are you doing what you do? And it all stems from the heart, and that's why he says, guard it, protect it. Because if the heart gets poisoned, if the heart gets hard, well, you're in trouble as far as the direction, the course of your life. You might remember we talked about King David. King David is the only man who God ever said this about. He's a man after my own heart. He only said that about King David, and yet we know that King David's heart grew cold and hard at some point, to the point where not only did he sin by committing adultery and murder, but he didn't even seem to care. He didn't even seem to hear God screaming his name, trying to get his attention, so God had to send the prophet Nathan. In reality, the entire nation of Israel, when you read through the Old Testament, is in that same scenario. They would tend to be very close to God, trusting God for a period of time, obeying God, close to the heart of God, and yet their hearts as a collective would turn hard Remember? And they would then go off the rails, off the tracks, and they would start to worship other gods. And then they got into this cycle. God would then do something to get their attention. And lo and behold, they'd repent, confess what they'd done, repent, come back close to him. It's this cycle. And so the question is that cycle still true today in our lives? And I think, and you probably would agree, it is. It is. We tend to have soft hearts towards God for a period of time, but then we get off track, then we start to lose focus on who he is and our relationship with him, and our whole lives get off track. That's why Solomon says, guard your heart, protect it so it doesn't get hard. All right, discussion question. Last week I challenged you to pray and ask God to reveal the truth about the condition of your heart. So the discussion question has to do with that challenge. How did it go last week? Did you ask God to reveal the real condition, the true condition of your heart? And if so, what did you hear from him through God's word or from things that he brought into your life? Have a great discussion. So if we are to really guard our hearts and really protect whether or not they're turning cold and hard or remaining soft and warm towards the will of God, we need a plan. And so we're going to start with a plan. So I want to take you back to Proverbs 29:18. And again, such wisdom came from the pen of Solomon. And this is a very famous passage, but sometimes misunderstood. But it'll help us get on track to having a plan in dealing with our heart, since he previously said, hey, you got to guard your heart because your whole life flows from it. So here's what it says in Proverbs 29:18. For lack of vision, the people perish. What does that mean? Everybody needs to go to the optometrist? What does it mean? Lack of vision. In other words, there might be wisdom, and then other translations get deeper into it. The NIV says, where there is no revelation, people cast off restraint. And then he goes on to say, but blessed is he who heeds wisdom's instructions. We cast off restraint. We say, I don't want to be ruled by anyone or anything in my life. I just want to do as I please. That's what happens when there's no revelation, is what Solomon says through the NIV. Now with the NLT, when people do not accept divine guidance, they run wild. That's probably the easiest translation to understand, right? If you don't want any divine guidance, your life is going to run amok. It's going to run off the tracks, is what Solomon says. And he would know, because his did. All right? Divine guidance. What is that? Revelation, vision. It's all the same concept. And the idea behind it is, am I willing to hear from God? God is always wanting to communicate with us. But am I willing to hear it? And we can hear it in a lot of different ways. But it is a big deal that we hear and heed the wisdom of God, the direction of God, the guidance of God. So I want to suggest to you that if we are to have a plan, it would be wise for us to say that plan must involve hearing from God, listening to God, taking his wisdom and guidance and vision for our lives. But the truth of the matter is, oftentimes in history, and I believe today, hearing from God is rare. Not because God isn't speaking, not because God does not want to communicate. I take you back to 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, and it says, in those days the word of the Lord was rare. Can you relate to that? I think that's true today. Certainly in our culture. You don't hear the word of the Lord. You sit down and turn on the TV or get on your computer, unless you know exactly where to go. You're not going to by default hear the word of the Lord. And to be honest, once again, in the modern church, there's a chance you could be a part of the modern church for years and truly not hear the word of the Lord. You could hear a lot of good positive stuff, but not the word of the Lord. Let me reinforce that by taking you back to the prophet Amos when he wrote in Amos 8:11 through 13. The time is surely coming, says the sovereign Lord, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread or water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. People will stagger from sea to sea and wander from border to border, searching for the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. Beautiful girls and strong young men will grow faint in that day, thirsting for the Lord's word. See, that's kind of a tough one, because we're saying, well, if God's always wanted to communicate to us, why is he sending a famine of his word on the land? I would suggest to you that it's because people no longer care about what God's input is on their lives, in our lives in this world today. And so he just pulls back and says, go ahead and I'll just wait until you thirst for it, until you hunger for it. But until that time, there will be a famine of the word of God. And I think we're close, actually. Did Amos write that for our times? No, not at all. It was aimed at the people of Israel, but I think it could be applicable to our lives today, don't you think? That the word of God has become kind of non-existent in our culture, maybe even in the modern church. Remember the back half of that passage where there is no vision, the people perish. They cast off restraints. And we're seeing that so much. Let me give you one example of this. I told you this series that we wrote, this curriculum we wrote many years ago, 25 years ago, had to do with training parents. So let me take you to one of the most clarifying passages when it comes to parenting in all of Scripture. It happens to be in Proverbs as well, in Proverbs 22:16, where we read this very famous passage, train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. All right. So the word of the Lord is train up your children. So what is Proverbs 22:6 saying? What's a command from God? That we are to arrange our lives around bringing our children to know God. And when they are old, the word actually means when they get hair on their chin. So that'd be the teen years. All right. A lot of people say, well, I'm believing that when they're 70 years old, they'll come back to him. That promise from Scripture is that if you will train them, when they get to be teenagers, which is the time these days when there's utter rebellion, right, and running away from what parents have believed by kids. But it is then that Solomon says they will come back, even if they've wandered a little bit, if they've been trained, when they become teenagers and those years beyond that, they will come back. Now, what is that passage? Well, obviously, it's about making sure that God is known in every generation, and that'll happen by parents doing their job. It's reiterated, of course, in the New Testament, in Ephesians chapter 6. But the point is this: God is saying, here is my guidance. Here is my revelation to you. And the truth of the matter is, and I hate having to say this, but I've said it before, I'm going to stick to my guns on this one. In the modern church, certainly in the culture, they could care less about training their kids to know God. But in the modern church, for the most part, this is falling on deaf ears. Most parents are not interested. It's either too hard, I don't have time, that's someone else's job. That feels like a restraint to us as parents. So we've cast it off, and now we all go wayward. It's what that passage back in Proverbs says. We cast off the restraints, and we will suffer the consequences. Now remember what the last part of Proverbs 29:18 says. It says, the person who heeds the revelation of God, the guidance of God, the vision of God, they will be blessed. So what we have in this culture, and in even the culture of the church, is we have people who are not experiencing God's blessing because there was no training. We cast that aside and said, I don't need that revelation. And so we come to this place where we say, if I'm to train up my child, then what does that mean? Well, that's just a small piece of the idea of training. So I take you now to 1 Timothy 4:7 through 10. We talked about this last week, but it's really important that we go back over it, that you really get this down deep in your heart. Paul writes to Timothy and says, do not waste time arguing over godless ideas, and the word there is actually myths, things that everybody thinks are true, but they're not true. That's what a myth is. Do not spend your time on myths and old wives' tales, Paul writes. Instead, train yourself to be godly. Okay, so that's the bigger picture. Okay, we got off on a side note there with the parenting thing, but it actually applies to every one of us, that we train ourselves to be godly, to have the heart of God, to draw near to the heart of God. Now that word train, we didn't get deeply into it. We defined it in terms of arrange the habits and practices of your life so you can accomplish what otherwise would never be accomplished. But the word train there is really interesting. It's the word gymnazo, which means gymnasium. What do you do in a gymnasium? Well, some people spectate, but most people, especially going back in history, a gymnasium was a place where they trained. And this is hilarious, but for some 1,300 years, going back at least 700 years before Jesus' time, the Olympics were run in the nude. Almost everybody that competed in the Olympics did so in the nude, just their birthday suits on. All right, I don't know if that attracted people. No, the reason was because they believed that having anything on would slow them down. And they had examples when they tried to run and their tunic or whatever would fall down below their waist and they trip over it. So the word actually means to compete in the nude. So the idea though was it was all about training, exercise. And now Paul does something so fascinating. He now applies it to our desire to live and become more like Jesus and follow after the heart of God. And he does so in verse 8. Physical training is good. Nothing wrong with physical exercise and training, be it in the nude or not, I don't know. But he goes on and says, but training for godliness now. Exercising and getting in shape regarding your heart for God is much better. Not just better, it's much better, promising benefits in this life and the life to come. This is a trustworthy saying and everyone should accept it, meaning you need to accept this. I need to accept this truth. This is why we work hard and continue to struggle. We toil, we work out, not just our muscles, and our bodies, more importantly, our hearts. And so that's where we're going in this series. How would you go about training your heart? Take you again to 1 Corinthians 9:25. All athletes are disciplined in their training. True. Paul knew that. We know that today. They do it, what is it? Training to win a prize that will fade away. Those prizes, those trophies, those medals will be thrown away. But we do it, what is it? Training for an eternal prize. You see, this is a theme with Paul. He says, I'm going to teach you how to train in a whole different way. And we need to get this. Like he said in the last passage, you must accept this as a reality, as a truth. Now I want to show you something that's really interesting. It's kind of indirectly related. In 2 Peter 2:12, he's talking about false teachers, false prophets, false teachers, and how they are influencing people. And he says this in verse 13, their destruction is the reward for the harm they have done. They love to indulge in evil pleasures in broad daylight. They are a disgrace and a stain among you. That doesn't sound very loving, does it? They delight in deception even as they eat with you in your fellowship meals. They're living amongst the body of Christ and they're lying to them and deceiving them. So he's warning about this idea. They commit adultery with their eyes. What a great way to say that. They may not actually physically be committing adultery, but with their eyes, they are. Men, how many of us fall into that category? He goes on, and their desire for sin is never satisfied. They lure unstable people into sin, and they are, watch this, they are trained. Guess what the word is? The word is again gymnazo. They are trained in greed. They live under God's curse. All of us train. All of us arrange the habits and practices of our lives to accomplish something. The problem is that way too many of us are training ourselves into greed. Things and money and that lifestyle is what matters to us. And we attend a church where they pat you on the back for that and promote you because You have trained yourself to greed, but he calls us to train to godliness, and that is to have the heart of God, which is a humble heart. One more discussion question. So what part of your life, what aspect of life is it in which you are training your heart? Okay, one caveat here. Don't for a second think that all this talk about training our hearts is about good works for salvation. That's not it at all. Our salvation comes to us as a gift from God through His grace, and so we put trust in Him. That's a done deal. But now what? Well, we're not going to work for our salvation, but now that we are saved, as Paul said in Philippians, we work it out. How do we work it out? By working out. By working out our heart, by putting our heart into training so we can come closer to the heart of God is the idea. So now that we have a plan, right? The plan is, let's hear from God what He wants us to do. Let's get the vision from God. Let's get the revelation from God, the guidance from God. Let's listen to it. Let's obey it, as Jesus said at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Let's live it out. Now I want to offer that maybe we need to kind of slow down and we have a plan, now get a picture. So what is a picture? A picture is a metaphor, and Jesus spoke in metaphors all the time. You might remember at the Sermon on the Mount, it was the rock, the life on the rock, the house on the rock was a metaphor for life living out the words of Jesus. You have the four soils that represent the condition of the heart we talked about last week. You have the pearl that was found of great price, or you have the treasure that's found in the field, and the person that found it goes and sells all that they have. It talks about how precious it is to find life with Christ. These are all pictures, metaphors. So here's the picture that we're going to work with throughout this series. The picture, the metaphor that we're going to work with is the metaphor of walls. Walls. Okay, we're not trying to exclude anybody or seclude ourselves from anybody, but the point of walls was an enormously important thing in the Old Testament. Every city had to have walls around it to guard the city, the heart of the city, from enemies. So it makes sense that if Solomon says guard your heart, we should probably put some walls up around our heart. Again, not to close others out, but rather for training. Building walls around our heart has a twofold purpose. Number one, it is to guard our heart, but it's also to provide a place of training. Any athlete that takes training seriously has a place. They have a place. Could be down at the gym, could be down at the football field, it could be in their basement, but they have a place where they train. The question is, do we have a place where we train our hearts? And I'm suggesting today that that place occurs when we build walls, and we'll name those walls in coming lessons. But for now, the importance is to understand how vital it is that we build such walls. Many years ago now, a movie came out called Field of Dreams. You probably saw it. If not, I'll give you a quick description of it. It starred Kevin Costner, and it was about baseball. It was about people who love baseball, and this guy loved baseball, but he happened to be a farmer out in Iowa, I think, and all he had was cornfields, and he supposedly heard this voice, and kind of the idea behind it is, was that from God? And you find out, there's no way that's from God. Anyway, and the voice said, if you build it, they will come. Now, who is they? They are baseball stars from years gone by. I mean, from 100 years ago, that they would come. And so he built this baseball field in the middle of his cornfield. And sure enough, these guys came out of the corn. You know, it's kind of a corny story, I know. But the point is this. We're not going to build a baseball field. Not interested in that at all. We're going to build a training center with these walls. And I believe God might be saying, if you build it, it will happen. What will happen? Our heart will be trained. It will be guarded from things that poison it, and it will be trained to draw close to the heart of God. Now, I said that walls in the Old Testament were a big deal, big deal. Let me give you one example of that, how literally they were a big deal, and then go to the figurative side of walls, because that's what we're going to use. And by the way, I was given this metaphor when I was young, when I was in high school, junior high or high school, by the guy that mentored me, discipled me, and he's the one that introduced me to this concept, and it still lives with me today. My prayer is that maybe this is a metaphor that you can take on through life. So I take you to 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, and we'll jump to verse 14. Asa, king of Judah, did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He removed the foreign altars and the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. Remember, all those things represented Baal worship and other gods. He destroyed them. God told him to destroy those things. The Israelites had taken on that practice. He destroyed all those things. And then he says this, "Let us build up these towns and put walls around them with towers, gates, and bars. The land is still ours because we have sought the Lord our God. We sought him, and he has given us rest on every side." So they built and they prospered. He says, let's take this land back. Let's give it back to God. Let's build some walls around it. So that's a literal picture, and there are so many passages like that. We won't go into all of them. You can do a study on that, but you'll be amazed at how important walls around the city were. And remember, those walls were thick walls. I mean, 6-10 feet thick. Some people actually had houses in walls. Rahab, the harlot, had a house inside the wall of Jericho. And so here we go. We have this literal importance of walls. Now I want to go to the figurative side of it. And Ezekiel chapter 13, I'll read it in the Message, verse 8, is talking about false prophets again. And this is what God says about these false prophets. "The fact is that they've lied to my people. They've said, 'No problem, everything's just fine,' when things are not at all fine," God says. "When people build a wall, they're right behind them, slapping on whitewash. Tell those who are slapping on the whitewash, when a torrent of rain comes and the hailstones crash down and the hurricane sweeps in and the wall collapses, what's the good of the whitewash that you slapped on so liberally, making it look so good?" And God says, that's exactly what will happen. I'll let the hurricane of my wrath loose, a torrent of hailstone, anger. I'll make that wall you slapped with whitewash collapse. I'll level it to the ground so that only the foundation stones will be left. And in the ruin you all will die. You'll realize that I am then God. I'll dump my wrath on that wall, all of it, and on those who plastered it with whitewash. I will say to them, there is no wall, and those who do such a good job of whitewashing it wasted their time. What is he talking about? So back in Old Testament times, what would happen sometimes is people who were in charge of making sure the walls around the city were secure and that they weren't falling down, they would just paint it white, all right? And when it was painted white, everybody would say, oh, it looks so good. Inside it was corroding and falling apart, but nobody knew because on the outside it had white paint on it. And God says that's what these false prophets are doing. They're saying everything's good. Just follow us down the path we're going. And they're slapping, God says figuratively, they're slapping white paint on the walls. See, this is a figure of speech God is using so you can see how important it was back in those days. One more example, Isaiah chapter 60, verse 18. Violence will disappear from your land. The desolation and destruction of war will end. Salvation will surround you like city walls. So again, that's a figurative, spiritual way of saying that what you really need are walls, and salvation will act as walls around your heart, is what the prophet Isaiah is saying. Okay, so that's the metaphor. That's the picture. Again, don't run away with it. Don't get crazy with it. It's not about, building a little fort and you don't ever talk to anybody. We're talking about an opportunity to guard and train our hearts.
So now that we have a plan, and that is we need to hear from God. Our hearts need to hear the vision God has for our lives, the direction, the guidance. That's the plan. Let's do that. Now we have a metaphor, and that is now we need a place where God can speak to our hearts, because it is from our hearts that we live. Now we have that. Now let's talk about the process. Okay? This is a good idea. That's a good idea. But let's get practical. Is there a process that we could go through in order to actually be guarding our hearts and training our hearts to follow hard after God? Of course, you know that the word church in the New Testament is ecclesia, which means those who are called out for something. It's about people. It's not a place. And you might be saying, yeah, I thought we were people. Now you want us to create a place? Hang with me here. And so it is for the church, the people, then that we turn in the New Testament, and we got to come face to face with a harsh reality. And let me read to you a couple passages, and that'll get us going towards getting really serious about creating this space or this place. I go to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. You're a chosen people. Okay, not a chosen building. You're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praise of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So you say, sweet, we're a people, we received the mercy of God. Hold on. Verse 11, dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles. You're not just the people of God. You don't belong where you are on this earth. I call you to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Wage war on your heart. There is a war going on. The good news is we're God's people. The bad news is we're in the midst of this war. How about Revelation chapter 12, verse 17? Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring. That's us. We're the offspring of Mary's giving birth to Jesus. We are that people that came from Jesus. And he says, and the dragon has waged war against us. So here is the thing you got to grab onto, and it is that the church is not an audience to be entertained. It is an army to be prepared. Did you get that? Too many of us think that being the church is, it's about me being entertained. No, it's about us being an army, and we must be prepared. I give you another couple passages here. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle, our war, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. There's a very famous pastor right now in Atlanta, Georgia, that has come out and said and written in a book, we should stop talking, using all this war language because it turns people off. You know, too bad he couldn't have been back in Paul's time and convinced him to knock it off, because it's Paul, the Apostle Paul, by the Holy Spirit, that says, war, war, war. You have got to come to grips with the fact that you are in a war. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 3, for though we live in this world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Okay. Do you get it? We're in a struggle. We're in a battle. We're in a war. And that's the reality of who we are as God's people here. That, then, should help us understand there needs to be a place that we can go for protection, for the protection of our heart. As Solomon said, guard your heart. We need to protect it from the enemy, and we're going to build that. But it's not just protection, it's also training. Okay, to do this now, the rest of our lesson, I want to go back to the Old Testament to a guy named Nehemiah. So if you want to turn back to Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, let me give you the background. The year is about 444, 445 BC, and he is the cupbearer to the king of Persia. All right, he's Jewish, but he's a cupbearer to the king of Persia, a guy named Artaxerxes, King Artaxerxes. What happened about 100 and some years earlier, 580 something, the Jewish people were taken captive, taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. In the meantime, Persia took over Babylon. Things have calmed down. As you can imagine, after 70 years, and it'll be plus once we get to Nehemiah, people have lived their whole lives in Persia. That's all they've ever known. But they know the stories of Jerusalem and how it was crushed and destroyed and how their parents were brought here. You've heard of people like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, that's who we're talking about. Okay, it's the same time frame. Now we're coming to 444 BC. 2 waves of Jewish people have gone back to Jerusalem. They've been given the freedom to go back and try to get their lives going again as Jews in Jerusalem. Now Nehemiah leads a 3rd wave back, and you're going to find out why he did that. I'm going to give you, we talked about process, so I want to look at Nehemiah's process that he went through. And I'm going to go through it lickety-split. I mean, we're going to go quick. And I'm going to give you what did he do in that moment, and then I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to jot the question down because that'll be your challenge for this next week, is to go through these questions. Remember how Nehemiah did all this. So Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king, which means he was very important because he tasted everything before the king did in case someone wanted to poison the king. And so he has that kind of relationship with the king, even though he's Jewish. And this brings us to our location. We are so blessed that most of the time our location has a background that is interesting. It is sometimes beautiful. And neither are true today. We're in our backyard. In fact, we're actually watching our grandsons right now. So you might see them commando crawling across the yard or using the tree for things. But the point is this: our location is important because behind me you see a fence, at least part of a fence, because the other part of the fence blew down. Sometimes we'll get winds up to 60, 70 miles an hour up here on this hill on which we live. And that fence actually extends all the way down the yard and around. It's maybe 80 yards. It's a long fence, maybe 100 yards. But inevitably, at some point during the year, because of the winds, part of it blows down, and that happened before Thanksgiving. So let me give you how long it's been that fence has been down, and it's been approximately 60 days. That plays into what we're going to talk about now. I'm going to actually spoil the story of Nehemiah. If you've never heard it, I'm going to spoil it for you because Nehemiah is going to build a wall around Jerusalem. It takes he and his co-workers and families 52 days. 60 days, still down. 52 days, an entire wall around the city of Jerusalem. That's why we're here. By the way, if you're one of those people who tends to look at stories in the Old Testament as fables or fantasy or nice stories but not true, in 2007, archaeologists actually unearthed part of the wall Nehemiah built back in 444 BC. Isn't that incredible? And they know that because there's Persian pottery and tools that they date back to that time. Okay, so what I want to do is simply do this. I want to fly through his story, give you 4 elements that were there in his process, and see if we can use any of those elements as we begin to build our training center for our hearts. All right, so I'm going to give you the principle, read some of the passage to you, and then I'm going to give you a question to be pondering in this next week on each of these points. So here we go. The first point I come across when I read the story of Nehemiah is what I'm going to call sorrow to surrender. Sorrow to surrender. It's chapter 1. Starting in verse 1, he talks about the fact that he was living in the city of Susa there, and he was a cupbearer to the king. He was Jewish, but a cupbearer to the king, and so he had this relationship with him. Probably had lived all his life there, and so we pick the story up, and he's waiting for some people to come back from Jerusalem. 2 waves, again, of people have gone to Jerusalem, and then some of his friends come back, and he says to them, what is going on in Jerusalem? Well, the temple was being rebuilt, but the walls around the temple, walls around the city of Jerusalem,
were still just down and burnt. And so they give that news to him, which is terrible news in Old Testament times, because then the city is vulnerable to enemies and to attack. As we pick up in verse 3, where these friends have come back to tell him about this, and they say, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. There's a real problem there. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. Listen to how Nehemiah reacts to this. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then I said to the Lord. So he spends several days mourning, weeping over the homeland and how it seems hopeless for it. And now he moves, though. Nothing wrong with emotions as long as we don't get stuck there. He moves now to surrendering to the God of the universe. Watch what he says to him. He says, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. You know, we always talk about covenant, and you may be surprised that even back then, that was the main topic for the people of God. You keep your covenant of love for those of us who have entered into it, he says. Now he asks him, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. And then he quotes Moses at a time when Moses said, God will at one point scatter these people, but then he'll bring them back. And so he's claiming that promise. So look what he does. He surrenders to the authority of God. You are the ultimate authority, and we surrender to you, and we know that it is your doing that has allowed this to happen because of our disobedience, and it will be your doing when you bring us back together. He is just saying, God, I acknowledge who you are. That's much more important than how I feel about circumstances that I see as just tragic. So the first aspect of his process is to go from sadness and sorrow to surrendering to God, a really important part of the process of building anything that's going to be meaningful and lasting. So the question I pose when I look at this passage, this part of the passage that I want to pose to you is this: am I able to move from emotions to surrender and adoration of who God is? Very important question. Am I able to do that? What does that look like? Okay, the second aspect of his process of going back to Jerusalem and building the walls is this. It is a royal ask. A royal ask. We see it in chapter 2, verses 4 through 5 and verses 7 through 9. And so Nehemiah goes to the king. Now remember, his job is to taste everything that the king tastes to make sure that it's not going to poison and kill the king, so he would die first. And so the king is used to him coming, but it's usually at mealtime. I don't think this is at mealtime. Maybe it is. But he comes and he asks him a question. That wasn't really his role, to ask questions of the king, but he makes this royal ask. But it's more royal than even you know. Here we go. The king said to me, what is it you want? And then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. That is one of the greatest lines, I think, in the Bible. I first turned to the King of Kings, and I talked to him in that moment, and then I turned to this king and answer his question. What a great model that is for the process of how do we go about this. Do we actually do that? Do we actually, before answering questions, just ask God quickly, help me with this? And then he goes on to say, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. He goes on in verse 7. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have letters to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he'll give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. Holy cow. Holy cow. It's a royal ask. It's a big ask, isn't it? It wasn't just, can I leave for a while? It was also, and I need your help. I need your influence so that this can be a successful journey. Question then that I find in that passage is this: am I afraid of the big ask? Are you afraid of the big ask? There are sometimes things that you need to ask of God, of others, and it's big. And remember, before you talk to others, talk to Him. So the third aspect we're going to look at quickly here in his process is what I'm going to call an honest evaluation. And we find it in chapter 2, verses 13 through 18. He has now traveled back to Jerusalem. He gets there, and you're going to hear him say, the very first thing is that he's not going to talk to people and tell them what he's going to do. He instead is going to honestly evaluate the situation. So he travels through the city at night, not wanting anyone to notice what he's doing. And then he comes to the wall, and he said, I began examining the wall, verse 15, and then finally I turned back and re-entered the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or to the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, here's the evaluation. You see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be a disgrace. It was a disgrace for a city in Old Testament times to not have protection, to not have a place where they could keep the people safe. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But it all started with an honest evaluation. Yeah, he did not just kind of say it's no big deal here, we're just going to do a little thing. He tells them, honestly, we are in absolute trouble. So the question that I ask myself when I read that, and I want to pose to you as well, is this: have I done an honest evaluation of my heart? That's where we started last week. And the hearts of my family members as well. Especially for those of us who are leaders of our family, it really is up to us to evaluate the situation for our entire family. Where are our hearts? What needs to be done? Can we be that honest about life? And Nehemiah was that honest. So now we come to the fourth aspect of the process he goes through, and I'm going to call it building is battling. Building is battling. We see it in chapter 2, chapter 4, and also in chapter 6. I'll read portions of all of those. Here we go. Chapter 2, verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. I'm not going to go into who these guys are, but they are enemies of his. They are in powerful political positions, and they don't want change. They like things the way they are. Have you ever experienced that in any organization, in any church? People who don't want things to change. And you say, but the walls are down. And they say, so what? What are you doing here? And they're afraid that he's going to come in and try to become king, and he's going to try to take them out of their positions of power. And that's what most people are afraid of when it comes to change. And so we go on. They say, what is this you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king, meaning the king of Persia? Does he know you're doing this? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. They ask about human authorities approving of this, and he says, the God of heaven is how this will succeed. I bow to a greater king, is what he says. But this building will include more battling. Like he begins this battle right now with these powerful political leaders. And then he goes on. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. Notice he puts everything in perspective. The God of heaven is in charge of this project. We are simply the servants. We move on into the chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. Our enemies said, before you know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to their work. Then the Jews who lived near then came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. They will attack us. They are our enemies. They don't want this happening. This has turned into a battle. Let's move on to verse 14. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. I love that line. You need to fight for your families. And I'm saying that to all of you who are parents, who are especially men of families. You need to fight for your families. Quit just letting the culture ram their agenda down your kids' throats. Fight for your families, as Nehemiah says to these people. He goes on, when our enemies heard that we are aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each one to our own work. We got back to work. See this combination of building and battling? Verse 16, from that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people. Going on to verse 15, when our enemies had heard that we were aware of their plot, that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. From that day on, half of the men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Isn't that some picture? They go back to work. One hand they got a trowel, the other hand they have a sword. It is both building and battling, and I want to tell you, as we go about building a training center for our hearts, it'll be both building and battling all at the same time. That's why we started with those passages in the New Testament that says, he has waged war against you. This is about demolishing the arguments against God. I want to jump to chapter 6 now, and in verses 1 through 10, 7 different times the enemy comes and tries to scare and intimidate and actually attack the people, and specifically Nehemiah, thinking if they can cut the head off of this snake, it'll stop and then keep things the way they are. I pick up in verse 11 where Nehemiah says, but I said, should a man like me run away, or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go, he says with conviction and courage. It was all about intimidation. It was all about fear. It is the same today. We may be intimidated into not building these training centers for our hearts. We may be led to be fearful about pouring into the hearts of our children and our families, but we must remain on the wall is the idea behind this. Okay, 2 questions that came to me from this last part of the passage. Number 1, how easily am I intimidated by the enemy? Can you ask yourself that question this week? Are you easily intimidated by what you see going on in our culture, by the threats against God's people? Question number 2 was, why am I surprised at the fiery ordeal of building a training center for the hearts of my family and for myself? Chapter 6, verse 15 reads this way. So the wall was completed in 52 days. 60 days hasn't been enough to put the fence back. But what happened there was a miracle. And it was purely because there was a process that Nehemiah was a part of. And I love every aspect of it. For us, it is a figurative wall. It is a spiritual wall that we're going to build, not to hide out, but to guard our hearts
and train our hearts to follow after the heart of God, which is godliness. So the challenge this week, I challenge you to go back over those 4 aspects of the process that Nehemiah took on and just see where you are with all of those things, especially the questions, because it's time now for us to begin building, and I'm so excited about what awaits us. So let's wrap this up with a fascinating study, an experiment that took place over 50 years ago by a psychologist by the name of Solomon Asch. And Solomon Asch was an expert, his area of expertise anyway, was studying sociology and how different people reacted to pressure in societies. And so this experiment will make total sense for you now. So what he did is, I think he took about 10 people, let's say it was 10 people, put them in a room around a table, and he then said, I'm going to show you a series of cards. And on the first card that I'm going to show you is a series of lines, 3 lines, labeled A, B, and C, I think it was. And he said, I want you one by one to tell me which of those lines are the longest lines. But what you need to know is that built into the study was the fact that 9 of the 10 people were shills. They were already in on it, and they'd already been instructed to always vote for line B, which was not the longest line. Line C was. So it kind of looked like this. All right? So if you can see that, line A was the shortest by far. Line B was then the medium line, and then line C was the longest, but 9 of the 10 people had been instructed to always say line B is the longest. And so what Asch was trying to figure out is, when that happens, what does the 10th person, what does the last person do when they see something that's obviously not true? Will they stay their ground? Will they stay independent of 90% of the people? Or will they conform? And you know what happened. 74% of that 10th person in these studies, they adjusted truth to fitting in to the rest of the group. So 74% of the time, the person who was last said, okay, B. I'll go with that, B. Even though they knew that wasn't true. And here's another cool thing about it. Of the 26% that stuck to their guns and said, no, C is the longest line, I don't care what these yahoos say. Of those 26%, they noticed on every one of them a sense of anxiety over this decision. In other words, it is very difficult to stand your ground on what you believe to be true when everybody else is going a different direction. And boy, did we see that in the last 2.5 years in this culture, didn't we? Almost everybody went one direction. And for you or I to stand our ground and say, it's not the truth I see, boy, that sets you apart, and it can be a very anxious and worrisome thing for a lot of people. Now, why do I end with that study? This idea of building figurative walls may sound crazy. In fact, most people would go, what is that about? Like some psychotic, exercise you're involved in? No, it is very much a spiritual exercise as we build these walls and we examine how can we get our hearts in a place where they are guarded, as Solomon said. And then he said those people are blessed who do that. And not only will our hearts be guarded, I believe, when we build these walls, but they will also go into an opportunity to be trained after the heart of God. And that's what I'm really excited about. So thank you for joining us. I know it's a little different, but don't be afraid to go the way of the 26% in this case. The very few who say, let's do this, let's build these walls. And even if other people go, that sounds weird, don't worry about it. This will be a great thing when we have gone into the training of our hearts and prepared them to follow hard after the heart of God. It's so great to be with you. So glad we're doing this series together. God bless you in your journey. I'm so glad we get to do it with you.